The radio began speaking in Michael's own voice, repeating conversations he'd never had with people he'd never met. Static crackled between words as his doppelganger discussed intimate details of his childhood trauma, his mother's death, his mounting gambling debts that threatened to consume everything he'd worked for. The headlights of oncoming cars flickered in perfect synchronization with the phantom broadcasts, each flash revealing the dashboard clock spinning backward through hours that had already passed. Michael gripped the steering wheel as his reflection in the rearview mirror moved independently, turning to smile at him with teeth that weren't his own. The phantom Michael in the glass mouthed words that emerged from the radio speakers. You can't outrun what you owe, and they know exactly where you live. Through the windshield, street signs rearranged their letters into warnings, written in languages that predated human speech, while the asphalt beneath his tires began to bubble and hiss like molten tar. The Chucky doll materialized in his backseat first, as a whisper of orange hair in the peripheral vision. Then, as the full grotesque figure perched on the leather upholstery with button eyes that tracked Michael's every movement. Its stitched mouth opened to reveal rows of needle teeth as it spoke in the voice of Tony Marconi, the loan shark whose patience had expired 3 weeks ago. 73,000, Michael. Interest compounds daily, even in hell. The doll's plastic fingers drummed against the window glass, each tap corresponding to another $1,000 added to his impossible debt. Michael swerved as the speedometer needle spun wildly between 0 and infinity, the engine roaring with sounds no combustion motor could produce. The Chucky doll giggled and produced a deck of cards from its overalls, shuffling them with supernatural dexterity, while each card displayed Michael's face in various states of terror and desperation. Want to double or nothing? The doll asked, its voice shifting between Tony's Brooklyn accent and something far older and hungrier. I know a game where the house always wins. The highway stretched impossibly long before them, mile markers counting backward into negative numbers, while the fuel gauge remained perpetually at empty. Yet the car continued its relentless forward momentum. Michael's hands refused to turn the steering wheel toward any exit ramp, his body no longer entirely under his own control. Behind him, the Chucky doll began dealing cards onto the seat, each one landing with the wet sound of fresh blood hitting concrete. Pick a card, any card, it crooned, but remember, in this game, every hand is a losing hand. Road signs now displayed Michael's banking information, his mother's maiden name, his social security number spelled out in letters 20 feet tall. Other drivers turned to stare at him through their windows, their faces identical copies of his own, but wearing expressions of judgment and disappointment he recognized from his father's funeral 5 years ago. The Chucky doll leaned forward between the seats, its breath carrying the scent of casino carpet and broken dreams. They're all waiting for you, Michael. Everyone you've disappointed, everyone you've lied to. They want their money back, too. The car radio began broadcasting his own heartbeat, amplified 100-fold, the bass vibrating through his chest until he could feel his ribs threatening to crack. Emergency vehicles appeared in his mirrors, ambulances, fire trucks, police cars, all driving in reverse with their sirens playing his mother's voice, calling his name from her deathbed. The Chucky doll shuffled its cards faster. the plastic clicking rhythm matching his accelerated pulse, while streetlights overhead exploded in sequence like dominoes falling towards some predetermined destination. Michael recognized the neighborhood emerging around him, despite the impossible geometry of streets that folded back on themselves and houses that stood at angles that defied physics. His own home appeared at the end of a cul-de-sac that hadn't existed when he'd left for work that morning. The windows glowing with the sickly yellow light of cheap casino bulbs. The Chucky doll clapped its hands together as the car's brakes engaged without Michael's input, bringing them to a stop in his driveway. "Home, sweet home," it whispered. "Time to pay what you owe." The front door of his house opened before he could leave the car, revealing not the familiar interior, but an endless casino floor stretching into smoky darkness. Slot machines lined impossible corridors, while dealers with no faces shuffled cards at tables that extended beyond the horizon. Michael's reflection in every chrome surface showed him older, grayer, more hollow-eyed than he'd appeared in the bathroom mirror that morning. The Chucky doll hopped onto his shoulder with surprising weight, its orange hair tickling his ear as it whispered, "Welcome to the house that debt built, Michael. Every bet you ever made is still running." Inside the casino house, the slot machines displayed his life choices instead of fruit symbols. His decision to skip his mother's chemotherapy appointments to play poker. His choice to refinance the house for one last big score. His promise to his sister Emma that he'd gotten help for his addiction. The dealers wore the faces of everyone he'd borrowed money from, their hands moving in perfect synchronization as they dealt cards that burst into flames the moment they touched the felt. The Chucky doll guided him through the maze of tables while speaking in Tony's voice. "Time's up, gambling man. The house is calling in all debts." Michael found himself seated at a poker table across from 5 versions of himself at different ages. The teenager who'd placed his first bet. The young man who'd proposed to Linda with a ring bought on credit. The father who'd missed his daughter's recital for a sure thing at the track. The desperate man who'd forged his mother's signature on her will. And finally, a future version of himself with hollow sockets where his eyes should be. The Chucky doll served as dealer, its movements precise and mechanical as it distributed cards that showed not suits and numbers, but moments of Michael's life where he'd chosen gambling over everything else. "Final hand," the doll announced, its voice now a chorus of every creditor, every family member, every friend he'd betrayed for one more chance at the jackpot. The cards in Michael's hand burst into flames that didn't burn, but instead showed him visions of what he'd lost. Linda's trust when she'd discovered the second mortgage. Emma's disappointment when he'd asked her for money at their mother's funeral. His daughter's confusion when he'd promised to attend her birthday party, but had instead spent the afternoon at an underground game in Chinatown. Michael understood with crystalline clarity that the only way to end this nightmare was to refuse to play the hand, to fold not just the cards, but the entire pattern of choices that had brought him to this moment. He pushed back from the table as the Chucky doll's face transformed into a mask of rage, its plastic features melting and reforming while it screamed threats in voices of everyone he owed. With deliberate precision, Michael grabbed the deck of burning cards and threw them into the slot machines, watching as the entire casino house erupted into flames that consumed every trace of the supernatural architecture. The fire spread with unnatural speed, dissolving the impossible geometry and revealing the interior of his actual home, modest and real and blessedly ordinary. The Chucky doll writhed in the flames, its final words a promise that the debt would follow him wherever he went. But Michael was already moving toward his computer to begin the process of bankruptcy, of confession, of rebuilding something authentic from the ashes of his deception. Outside his windows, dawn was breaking over a world that followed predictable physical laws, though he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would never again trust his reflection completely, never again assume that the faces in passing cars belonged to strangers. The business card for Tony's operation curled to ash in his wallet without explanation. But Michael felt the weight of genuine consequences settling onto his shoulders like a familiar coat. He picked up his phone to call Emma, to tell her everything, to begin the long work of earning back trust through actions rather than promises. The supernatural terror had passed, but the real horror of facing what he'd become without the buffer of delusion stretched ahead of him like a road with no shortcuts, only the honest possibility of reaching something worth calling home. 2 years later, Michael discovered that some supernatural debts carry compound interest beyond the grave. The recovery meetings had become routine. His relationship with Emma had slowly healed, and he'd found work as a night janitor at a small office building when the manifestations returned with calculated precision. This time, the Chucky doll didn't appear in mirrors or back seats, but emerged from the cleaning supply closet at 3:17 a.m., its plastic form coated in fresh grave dirt and carrying the metallic scent of old pennies. The fluorescent lights above flickered in Morse code patterns, spelling out banking account numbers Michael had closed months ago. "Time to collect on the principal," the doll announced, its voice layered with harmonics that suggested multiple entities speaking through the same plastic throat. The office building around them began shifting, cubicles rearranging themselves into maze patterns, while ceiling tiles fell upward, defying gravity as they assembled into floating platforms that formed impossible staircases leading nowhere. Computer monitors throughout the building powered on simultaneously, their screens showing live feeds of Tony's crew searching Michael's old neighborhood, still hunting for payment on debts that bankruptcy couldn't touch. Michael clutched his mop handle like a weapon, while the Chucky doll produced a contract written on human skin, its terms scrolling endlessly in languages that hurt to read. "Your mother signed this before you were born," it explained with surgical calm. Generational gambling addiction isn't hereditary, it's contractual. Every Marconi debt passes to the next bloodline until someone pays in full. The building's elevators opened to reveal not interior cars, but vertical casino floors, each level representing a different generation of his family's compulsive betting, stretching back to ancestors who'd wagered their immigration passage on rigged card games. The janitor's cart transformed into a roulette wheel, spinning with supernatural momentum, its numbers replaced by years from Michael's family history when gambling had destroyed marriages, bankrupted farms, and separated children from parents across 4 generations. The Chucky doll hopped onto the wheel's center, balancing perfectly, despite the violent rotation while dealing tarot cards that depicted Michael's future. homelessness, estrangement from Emma, and finally, a lonely death in a cardboard shelter behind the very casino where his great-grandfather had first played Pharaoh in 1923. Michael realized that his previous victory had been incomplete. He'd rejected his own gambling impulses, but hadn't addressed the supernatural contract binding his bloodline to perpetual debt. The building's windows now showed not the city street, but an endless cemetery where headstones bore the names of relatives who died poor and alone, their final bets still running somewhere in dimensions where time moved according to casino rules rather than natural law. The Chucky doll's laughter echoed from every speaker in the building's PA system, while it shuffled cards made from the deeds to properties his family had lost over the decades. "Here's the new game," the doll announced as the roulette wheel slowed to a stop, with Michael balanced precariously on its edge. "Win and the contract burns. Lose and your niece inherits the debt when she turns 18 next month. Emma's daughter gets to learn why her uncle really disappeared from family gatherings." The doll produced a single die made from what looked like compressed bone meal, its 6 sides showing not numbers, but faces of children Michael had never met. Future generations of his family tree, who would inherit his supernatural obligations if he failed to break the cycle. Michael understood with chilling clarity that this confrontation demanded not just personal transformation, but ancestral liberation. He grabbed the bone die before the Chucky doll could roll it, feeling its weight like concentrated generations of pain and poor choices. Instead of throwing it according to the doll's rules, he used his janitorial keys to scratch deep gouges into each face, carving over the family portraits until the die showed only blank surfaces. "I don't gamble anymore," he stated with absolute conviction. "Not with money, not with lives, and definitely not with contracts I never signed." The Chucky doll shrieked as the scratched die crumbled to powder in Michael's palm, its plastic form beginning to crack along seams that revealed emptiness beneath. The office building shuddered back toward reality, ceiling tiles settling into proper positions, while the supernatural casino elements dissolved like fever dreams. But Michael wasn't finished. He pulled out a lighter he'd carried since quitting smoking and set fire to the skin contract, watching as generations of supernatural debt burned away in flames that smelled like freedom rather than destruction. The last image Michael saw before the building returned completely to normal was Emma's daughter playing safely in her bedroom, unaware of the supernatural inheritance that had just been cancelled. The Chucky doll collapsed into ordinary plastic pieces, its evil dissipated, but its lesson permanent. Some victories required protecting others rather than just saving yourself. Michael resumed mopping the office floors with movements that felt lighter, knowing that his recovery had evolved from personal healing into generational liberation. One honest decision at a time.